Up where we left off yesterday. Yesterday we went through verses 8 through 17 of chapter 1 of Romans. Now we're going to pick up at verse 18, and we're going to go through verse 32. Now, chapter 1 is heavily related to chapter 2, because Paul is going to indict the Gentiles in chapter 1, and then he's going to go on to indict the Jews in chapter 2. And he's going to indict them with different manners of law. One with natural law, and one with given law or special revelation. And he's going to contrast the two a little bit. Now, we're only going to touch chapter 1 today, but we are going to, hopefully I'll give you the tools where you can look at chapter 2 and see the contrast. And we're going to touch on it a little bit, but we're going to spend most of our time looking at chapter 1 and how Paul develops his argument. And I believe it's a perfect transition because it's going to explain the why really behind what Brandon said earlier about how there are more egregious sins. And so we're going to do that for a little bit this afternoon. And so the big question is, what happens if you've never heard the gospel, or God has never spoken to you directly, or you've never received special revelation from God? Can God still judge you? That's a question a lot of people want to know. They want to know, well, what about people in the Amazon, or what about people in these tribes who have never been contacted? Are they amenable to God? And the answer will be yes. I'll give you the simple answer right now. The answer is yes. But we're going to explore the why behind that yes as we go through this study. And so, in Genesis 18:25, this is right before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham asked God a question. He says, "Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put to death the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous and the wicked are treated alike. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do justice?" Now the answer, of course, is the judge of all the earth will do justice. And he will not put to death the righteous with the wicked. But the question is not, will he put to death the righteous with the wicked? The question is really, who's righteous and who's wicked? And how do you go from wicked to righteous? That's the real question we're trying to ask today, or at least trying to start asking and start exploring today. And so, natural revelation, also called general revelation, is the truth that God reveals himself to all people through nature, creation, and human conscience, and really reason as well. I would add that in there. And there's no need for scripture or special communication to figure these things out. These things are learned, and all humans should be able to look at creation and look at their social relations with each other and be able to gather that these things are true, and these things are right, and these things are good. Now, this is going to come into play because when we speak to people who are not Christians and we talk to them about the gospel and why they need to obey the gospel, I'm going to say this: they're not sinners because they don't partake of the Lord's Supper every Sunday. They're not sinners because they don't sing a cappella music. They're sinners because they've rejected a God that they know. They've rejected a God that they know exists, and they've rejected revelation that they know is true. That's why. Now it's not a big difference for rejecting natural revelation to rejecting special revelation. The end result is still true. You've rejected the God that you do know. Now, special revelation is direct and specific communication from God that reveals truths about his will, his character, and the plan of salvation that cannot be known through nature or human reason alone. Did you catch that? Natural revelation is enough to condemn us. And that's all it's good for, really. Special revelation is enough to save us. So natural revelation, if you've never heard anything from God, natural revelation is enough to condemn you. But you need the special revelation for the second half of that. And so this notion of a built-in moral compass that we've just talked about, accessible without any extra revelation from God, is exactly what Paul appeals to in Romans 1 and 18 through 32 when he starts to indict the nations. And Gentiles really just means nations. And so he's showing us how God holds everyone accountable. Not just Jews to the law, but all of humanity. Now, if this is an important piece in Paul's argument, and we're going to touch on this a little bit later, but he's going to use this to set a trap for the Jews. He's using this natural revelation because they're going to be nodding their heads. They're going to be saying, yes, yeah, we agree with that, Paul. And then, as he goes into chapter 2, he's going to, Paul's going to do his best Nathan the prophet impression. He's going to talk about a subject, and he's going to talk about things, and then in verse 17, he's going to say, you are the man, essentially. You call yourself a Jew, but do you follow the law that you've been given? And so, really, Romans chapter 1 is an indictment of the Gentiles, but it's also setting a trap for the Jew. And so, let's begin. Romans 1, 18 through 20. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. God has been revealed, but he's been rejected, is what Paul's essentially said. The wrath of God being revealed is in contrast with his righteousness being revealed in verse 17. Did you catch that? In verse 17 he says, the way by which men can be declared righteous has been revealed. But you know what else has been revealed? The wrath of God has also been revealed. And one is going to lead to the other. And so the real truth here is you can either suppress the truth or you can confess the truth. There's no such thing as what you would call, I guess for lack of a better way to say it, there's no such thing as a true atheist. There's only someone who's rejected the God that they knew and started to become deluded. And so you have two options. You either confess the truth that you know, or you suppress the truth that you know. They're not rejecting what they don't know. That's an important point. They're rejecting what they know to be true. They're rejecting what they plainly see. Man's problem has never been that he does not have enough. Man's problem has always been that he has something and he rejects it. That's what man's problem is, and Paul's trying to drive that home. Things that can be known about God through creation are these. We can look and we can see his power. When you look at the rocks and the trees and the waterfalls and the hurricanes and the tornadoes, you can see God is powerful. You can look at the sky and the stars and see somebody created this. And that brings up an important point. Sometimes people say, oh, you can't just tell people to look at creation. That's not enough evidence. Apparently to Paul it was. Apparently Paul said, if you can look at creation and say there is no God, you're suppressing the truth. You can see his divine nature. You can see that God is divine. You can see he's powerful. You can even see something about his goodness in nature. And men are without excuse because they rejected these obvious things. That's what Paul's trying to drive home. He's saying these things aren't hidden from you. It's not as if you could not figure these things out. It's that they're there, they're obvious, you can see them, they're plain, and you've rejected it. If you can look at the human body and say anything but God had a hand and created this, you're deluding yourself. Because if we take the quote-unquote scientific view, what comes first? Does the heart come first? Or does the liver come first? What comes first, the circulatory system or the nervous system? What comes first? No, it all happened at the same time. And so only a powerful God could have created such a creation. It goes on in Romans 1, 21 through 23. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. Remember that. They did not give thanks to him. But they became futile in their thinking, useless really. And their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. And so, what did they stop doing? They stopped glorifying God as God and being thankful. That's not just a lesson for the Gentile, that's a lesson for the Jew. As we look through the history of the Old Testament, we can see Jews often did this. People who had special revelation often, they stopped glorifying God as God, they stopped being thankful, and then what happens? All manner of things begin to happen. That's what they began doing. Their thoughts became futile. They became useless. So when you don't give thanks to God and don't worship him as God, your thinking becomes stupid and useless, for lack of a better way to say it. Their hearts were darkened. We're going to touch on that a little bit later. Their hearts were darkened. Then they became fools because they knew better, but they weren't doing better. When Jesus speaks of a fool, he speaks of a man who hears what he says, but doesn't do what he says. When the Bible speaks of a fool, it speaks of people who know better, but they're not doing better. And then they resorted to idolatry. Idolatry is the only result of rejecting a God that you do know. Now, sometimes we begin to say, well, in today's day and age, people don't worship idols. Well, you've never been to India or other parts of the country. But people would go further and say, well, in America, it's different. People don't have idols in America. Do you remember when Jesus spoke to the Pharisees? He said that money had become their idol. Anything that you use to take the place of God becomes an idol. And eventually people start sacrificing things to idols. They start giving what's rightly God's to idols. Now, you may say, well, what are people sacrificing to idols today? Their families. They're sacrificing their true worship to God. And that's just in a, I guess you would say, a figurative way. But in a real way, people sacrifice children to the God of convenience. Now, I don't want to make this a talk about abortion and things like that. But what is going on, people say things like, well, you've got your career to worry about. You've got the rest of your life ahead of you. And so what did people do in the Old Testament? They used to take their babies and they would put them in the arms of Moloch and they would burn those babies alive for better crops, for prosperity. People today go to the clinic, get babies ripped out of them, and then they burn them in a furnace so that they can be successful, so that they can go and live their life, so they can go do things that they want to do to the God of convenience. And my advice would be, if you don't want to kill kids, don't do the things that create kids. If you're not willing, if that's something that you think is not a good thing, well then don't do the things that create children. Ecclesiastes 7:29 says, God made man upright, but they've sought out many schemes. It's not that man falls into schemes. He seeks them out. He finds them. When he forgets about God, he looks for things to do that are wicked. This is not passive, and that's an important thing. People who live in the Amazon rainforest who have never been talked to from a preacher, but they still worship idols and don't worship God, that's not a passive fall, but it's active and willful rebellion to the God that they do know exists. You can look at creation and see there's one God because of the continuity of creation. And if you reject that God, you're in willful rebellion. Idolatry is not the beginning of sin, but it's the result of suppressing the truth. You don't start with idolatry. You start with rejecting God and not giving him thanks. And then you move on to idolatry. What man calls enlightenment, God calls foolishness. There was a time in the world called the Enlightenment era. And this is when people started to say, we've moved past the need for God. We can really do things on our own. We can figure out things on our own. They were wise in their own eyes, so they became fools. There's some connections here. In Isaiah 44, Isaiah mocks the practice of making and worshiping idols. He talks about a man who he cuts down a tree, and some of it he burns to cook his food and keep himself warm, but some of it he creates into a god that he bows down to. What's the picture Isaiah is trying to paint? Stupidity. That's what he's trying to say. He's saying, when you take a wooden or a metal or anything that's not God and create an image of a man or a bird or a creeping thing and you say, this is my God, you look like an idiot, is what Isaiah is saying. That's the way he's saying. When man worships idols, he becomes useless like what he worships. When you worship animals, you'll act like an animal. When you worship men, you'll act like sinful men. Paul uses a descending order, and I think that's important. He starts with man, he goes to birds, he goes to animals, and then he goes to creeping things, reptiles, bugs, things like that. This reflects the degrading nature of idolatry. The more you worship idols, the more useless and disgusting and animalistic you become. And when we look at cultures who have gone in deep into idol worship, that's the case. You think of what did God say about the Amorites? The iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. It's not yet finished. Because they're going to get worse. Because they're idol worshipers. By worshiping creation, man inverts the created order. Instead of ruling and having dominion over creation and animals, man worships them as God. In Psalm 115 and 8, it says, those who make idols become like them. You become stupid. You become blind. You become deaf. And you become useless. You cannot do anything. And so we move on to verse 24 through 27. Therefore, because of all that, God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie. I'm going to stop and pause there. When you read the book of Romans, notice all the times Paul makes a switcheroo. And really that's a theme in Paul's writings in general. Paul always likes to make a little switcheroo. They exchanged the truth of God, and what they exchanged it for? For a lie, and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator. There's another switcheroo there. Who is blessed forever, amen. For this reason, God gave them up. You see, he gave them up, and then he gave them up. It's repetition. He's telling you, when you worship idols, God will give you up. He'll relinquish custody of you. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another. Men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. People say, well, it's not very kind to say that homosexuality is a mental disorder. Well, how about a dishonorable passion? Or how about contrary to nature? How about shameless acts? Or how about receiving the due penalty for their error? If people don't like mental disorder, what about receiving the due penalty for their error? And so, God gave them over. Giving them over implies God's relinquishing custody of them. He's saying, you're no longer mine. And he allows someone to go where they insist on going. When it says God gave them up is a synonym for their hearts were darkened. Because when God gives you up, the only thing left is to go into the dark because there's no more light. He cuts the lights off. And so he says, you're no longer mine, and he allows you to go where you insist on going. That's a scary thought. Paul talks about Gentiles in Ephesians. He says they're past feeling. The more you reject God, the closer you get to that point. I don't know exactly where that point is, but I never want to get there. And no one should ever want to get there, because the darker your mind becomes, the less the gospel has an effect on it. And so when I think of giving someone over, I always think of the best practical explanation is the parable of the prodigal son. Because what does the father do? The son says, give me my inheritance, I insist on going. And the father says, see you later. Because that's what he wants. That's what he insists on doing. When someone insists on rebellion, God no longer begs. God says, go ahead. When God removes his restraining hand, sin spirals unchecked. This is an act of punishment when God gives you up. This is God's wrath displayed through passive judgment. So it's active and passive at the same time. In 1 Timothy 1:20, there's a mercy in this, though. There's Hymenaeus and Alexander. And Paul says he's given them up to Satan that they may learn how to not blaspheme. So, simultaneously giving someone up is punishment, and it's a hope that they would learn to do better. Maybe if God takes his restraining hand away, you'll mess yourself up enough to where you'll come back to him, and you'll realize that was the right way. I rejected the God that I did know. Many times sin is its own punishment. It says that they received the due penalty for their error. That could just be homosexuality, or it could be the diseases and terrible things that comes from it. But I think homosexuality is a punishment in and of itself. You've now given up nature. That's why it's an egregious sin. Because that's why it's worse than, heterosexual fornication. Because that is a natural feeling. It's taken to a wrong place, but it's a natural feeling. Homosexuality is not a natural feeling. You're not born that way. Did you notice that? Paul says eventually God gives you up to that kind of behavior. There's no one born in that condition. Now, I am sympathetic. I will, for lack of a better word, will make a qualifying statement. There are people who have been abused. There are people who have suffered things that were not of no fault of their own. We need to be sympathetic of that. And so God does not cause anyone to sin, but he will allow you to pursue it more and more. If you decide you like that, if you decide you want to live in it, God will say, okay, wallow in the mud. And so, it says he gives them over to the lusts of their hearts. When people reject God, he gives them over to desires that violate the natural order. When you reject God, God says, okay, if you're going to reject me, you might as well reject everything that I have to do with. Instead of the mind ruling the body, now desire rules the human heart. Your head is supposed to tell your body to do good things, but instead now these desires, the flesh, is ruling you. They exchange truth for lies, so God allowed them to dishonor their bodies. It's a dishonor of your body to do things like homosexuality. It is a dishonor of your body to commit heterosexual fornication as well. But it's even more of a dishonor to commit homosexuality. Homosexuality goes against God's created order, and people know it's wrong. That's what Paul's getting at. Paul says you're without excuse for that behavior because you know it's wrong. How do they know it's wrong? Because we can look at the created order and say that's not the way things should be. We can look at animals and see that's not the way it's supposed to be. And so the male-female relationship is not just a biological thing, but it's a theological thing. It's a picture of how creation was meant to reflect God's purposes. Not only to be fruitful and multiply, but to picture Christ in the church. A man and his wife picture Christ in the church. A man and a man cannot picture Christ in the church. A woman and a woman cannot picture Christ in the church. But when a man loves his wife the way Christ loves the church and is the head of his wife the way Christ is the head of the church, and a woman submits to her husband and devotes herself to her husband the way the church devotes itself to Christ, that's what God wants. That's the picture God's trying to paint. And when you commit homosexuality, you're destroying God's picture. We remember what happened to Moses when he destroyed God's picture. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind. Or some of yours may say, what's the right word? There's that word, the Baptists like to use it. I can't even think of it right now. It's in the King James. What is it in Romans chapter 1? Trent? Reprobate mind. Thank you, someone with the King James. I appreciate you. And so they did not see fit to acknowledge God. God gave them up to a debased mind, or a reprobate mind, to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. That's a mouthful of sins right there. And so, what's a debased or a depraved or a reprobate mind? Appreciate that, brother. A mind that can no longer discern right from wrong. Eventually, your mind gets so corrupt it can't tell what's right or wrong. It's not discern. That's what the Bible describes wisdom as, by the way, being able to discern between right and wrong. You lose wisdom when your mind becomes this way. It's a conscience so dulled and corrupted by sin that it becomes unreliable, unable to think or reason in a way that aligns with truth or God's created order. God responds to rejection of truth by handing people over to the very things that they crave. That's a scary thought. That if you desire something enough and you seek after something enough, God will give you over to that. Isaiah 5:20 says, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet, or sweet and for sweet and sweet for bitter." Woe to the man who thinks he's wise in his own eyes, essentially. Woe to the man who thinks he knows things. When conscience is consistently violated, it becomes seared. What does it mean by a seared conscience? The way I like to think of it is like a callus. Maybe you started working outside at a certain age, or maybe you started lifting weights at a certain age. And at first you get blisters, and at first those blisters hurt, and at first they bleed, and at first you notice them, and at first you got to doctor them up. But after a while, the nerves get dead in there. After a while, the skin comes to get hardened. After a while, you don't feel the pain anymore. That's a mind that has been corrupted and seared by sin. The first time you do something, it may cause a response out of your conscience. The second time, a little bit less. The third time, less than that. And finally, if you keep pursuing sin, it gets to the point where you're past feeling and you don't care anymore. There's no hope for that person. Paul is arguing that Gentiles have no excuse. Why? Because God revealed himself in creation, verse 20. They rejected him and became futile in their thinking, verse 21. Their hearts were darkened, verse 21. Now their minds are corrupted in verse 28. Romans 1:28 is a downward spiral that begins as ingratitude and turns into a full moral collapse. God has not forced anybody to sin. All he's done is remove the restraint and allowed man to run rampant in his sin and receive the full consequence. It reminds me of Exodus 9 when God gives Pharaoh over to his stubbornness. It's not that God made Pharaoh reject him. It's not that God ordained from the foundation of the world that Pharaoh would reject him. It's that Pharaoh was a prideful and a stubborn man, and when he rejected what God told him, and he kept rejecting, God allowed him to get more prideful, and eventually it led to his demise. And it led to the demise of much of the nation of Egypt. The conscience that was once guided by natural law and revelation that comes from the natural order now becomes a tool of self-justification. Eventually, just sinning is not enough for people. Eventually, they've got to tell you why it's right. You notice that's how society goes? First sin goes, well, I'm just going to sin and that's the way I want to do it. But now, after I've done this a while, I've got to tell you why it's okay that I do it. And we're going to explore this a little bit in just a moment. The natural trajectory of sin is not self-correction. Sometimes we think, well, we'll let someone just kind of find their own way. No, that's not what people do. They don't self-correct. They self-destruct. And in verses 29 through 31, it shows what life turns into when natural law is ignored and minds are corrupted. Unrighteousness and evil are the breakdown of the moral order. There's selfishness and relative morality take over. That's the first sins that Paul mentions. He mentions unrighteousness and evil. You don't care about morality when you're no longer righteous. Then there's covetousness, envy, strife, deceit, and malice. This breaks down relationships. Nothing can prosper that way. This is disunity in families. This is disunity in communities. This is disunity at the state level. And eventually, sin becomes legislated in societies like this. Sin does not just affect the individual. It affects the community, it affects the family, and it affects the whole nation. And whole nations turn wicked because of this breakdown of God's order. And then finally he says hatred of God. This is someone who despises all moral authority. Does this sound like any society that you know of? People who hate moral authority. People who hate people to tell them what's right. People who don't care about objective morality. People whose families are in disunity. More and more kids are being raised by single parents in our country. And that's because of covetousness, envy, strife, deceit, and malice. That's why. Sin is the reason people suffer. And so, Paul mentions disobedient to parents. It's almost comical. There's all these sins here, and he's naming all these egregious sins, envy, murder, covetousness, and he throws in disobedient to parents in there. That's natural law, by the way. Humans inherently know it's good to obey your parents. Why? Because society cannot function when everybody's disobedient to their parents. What does a society turn into? Chaos. A society where people are disobedient to their parents tells me that no one is being raised right. And a society cannot function when nobody's raised right. It's a basic moral instinct. And its breakdown shows moral chaos starting early on in people's lives. When you see kids that are disobedient to their parents, and I'm not talking about kids who occasionally don't do what they're told to do. I'm talking about wild, unruly children. He says foolish, faithless, heartless, and ruthless. In a society where sin breaks it down, natural affection and rational thought have eroded. Women sacrifice their children in societies such as this. Men leave their families in societies such as this. These are not just bad behaviors, they're symptoms of sick souls. When there's no longer natural affection, when a man no longer cares about the family that he's had a hand in building, when a woman no longer cares about the child in her belly, they're sick and their soul is in jeopardy. Paul is showing what happens when a society lives by its own instincts and standards. This is what happens when man becomes his own God, not the ones built into creation. This is what happens when conscience is dull, truth is denied, and God is replaced. And we've already asked this question. Does that remind you of anywhere? Sometimes and I'm not saying this is the worst it's ever been. We talked about Rome last night. But our society is in a breakdown of the moral order. People are rejecting natural law more and more every day. They're rejecting the natural order of things. When you suppress natural law, you don't get freedom. That's the thing. Sometimes in our country, we think doing whatever you want is what freedom is. It's what liberty is, doing whatever you want. But doing whatever you want doesn't get you freedom, it gets you bondage. Because you become beholden to the things that you do. You become beholden to the flesh. You get fractured, you get societal decay, and you get self-destruction at the individual level. And so people know instinctively that these behaviors deserve justice in verse 32. What does he mean by that? Well, if you think about murder, stealing, and some of these things, these are punished by Gentile societies. These are punished by godless societies. If you murder someone in most societies, they'll kill you back. If you steal something in some societies, they'll cut your arm off. They know it's wrong. And so if you know instinctively that's wrong and you know people are being punished for it, what does it say about you when you practice them? You're judging yourself. Paul also teaches that applause is participation. I'm going to say that again. Applause is participation. When you don't speak up and when you say, maybe I don't live like that, but that's good for them, that's participation in their evil deeds. To approve of evil is to take moral responsibility for it. Sometimes people say, I wouldn't choose to live a homosexual lifestyle, but if someone wants to do that, that's fine. Paul says you're guilty of that sin because you've approved of it. When your friends do things that you know are wrong and you don't speak up, you've become a participator in their evil deeds. And the reason I'm saying this is because I've been in that situation before. I've not spoken up as a younger person when I should have spoken up. You take moral responsibility when you don't speak up and you approve of what they're doing. You're just as guilty in some ways as the one who commits it. So this is the progression of a sinful society. First, there's tolerating sin. And that's when sin's kind of weird, but you're like, whatever. Then you start justifying the sin. Then you start saying, well, maybe it's not a mental disorder. Maybe it's just the way people are. Maybe it's a preference. Then you start celebrating it. Then you've got Pride Month. Then you've got, let's celebrate these people. These people are heroes. And then you've got demanding others to affirm it. So it's never enough. It's never enough to sin. It always progresses further and further and further. It's never enough even to be celebrated. You have to have others agree with you. In a society in a society like this, when you are not tolerant of people's sin, that's the number one sin in their mind. They think you're a terrible person if you do not agree with them. A culture does not have to be full of murderers to be condemned. It only needs to celebrate those who murder. She's just doing what's best for her. She's just doing what's good for her for her career. She's got a whole life ahead of her, right? She's young. People celebrate those who murder, even if we don't think so. Sexual immorality is praised as freedom in societies like that. Greed is framed as success. Pride is rebranded as self-love. Don't you hear that a lot? You gotta love yourself. You gotta love yourself. You're number one. Don't do anything that upsets your peace. Don't let anyone around you that makes you not love yourself as much. Moral dissent is marked as intolerance, and like I said, intolerance is the paramount sin in a depraved society. When you do not tolerate people's sins in a society that's fallen in the way that Paul describes, people will think you're the sinful one. They'll call sweet bitter and bitter sweet. Romans 1:32 shows what that cultural participation in sin is not just about what we do, but it's about what we cheer for. So how do we attack this? We don't celebrate what God condemns. We don't allow culture to define our conscience, and we don't stay silent because approval equals endorsement of that sin. It puts the big picture. Man's problem is not that he doesn't know God. His problem is that he rejects the God he does know in favor of being his own God, or in favor of worshiping other things that he places as God in his life. So why does Paul condemn the Gentiles first? We're going to look at Paul's argument for a second. By doing this, Paul levels the playing field. The Gentile objection would be, well, we didn't know the law of Moses. Why are we sinners? We didn't know that. And after listening to Paul's condemnation of the Gentile nations, the Jew would be nodding his head emphatically, to which Paul would reply, then why do you practice the same things? If you think that stuff's so bad, why are you out here doing it? God is just in condemning all because he gave all sufficient light to be accountable. I'm going to say this. You do not go to hell because you've never heard the gospel. You go to hell because you rejected the God that you do know. That's why. There's no one who's innocent. And another qualifying statement. Paul's not talking about little babies or children. Paul's not talking about the mentally incompetent here. He's not talking about that. He's talking about people who know better and don't do better. In fact, in Romans chapter 7, Paul says there was a time that he was alive, but when the commandment came, sin revived and he died. That's the clearest passage for an age of accountability in the Bible. That does not mean that the age of accountability is a singular moment, but that means at some point people do become accountable. And there's a point where you're not accountable as well. So Paul's not speaking of innocent people like babies, little children, and those without the mental capacity to obey. For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves. Even though they do not have the law, they show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. This does not mean that the conscience is a perfect indicator of what's right and wrong, but it doesn't have to be. Because when you betray your conscience, you're betraying what you know to be right, at least in your mind. And you're sinning. You're going against that conscience. And there are some times your conscience is right. And when it is right and you go against it, you're definitely wrong. In fact, when we talk about conscience, conscience is your way to know. It's like your alarm system. It's like when you start to drift. Now cars have that alarm system where it's saying, well, you're drifting into the other lane. That's what your conscience does. It tells you when you're drifting. And we need to keep it sensitive to the things of God. Let's look at some intertextual examples of natural law. Number one, I think of the flood. It says, the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. His heart was evil continually. There was no law of Moses at this time. There was no written law at this time. Now, God did speak to the patriarchs in some instances, but he's saying you guys are evil. Why is the world evil? Because they rejected the God that they did know. God determined man was morally accountable for his sin because he knew better and he wasn't doing better. This text emphasizes violence, corruption, and wickedness. These are moral failures, not ceremonial violations. These are things people know to be true, but they don't do them. If God judged the entire world, then the standard must have been accessible to the entire world. If the entire world was destroyed, then the standard must have been accessible. They must have known better. It says, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Noah was a righteous man by faith. And so, we move on to Sodom and Gomorrah. Brendan mentioned this. The law of Moses was still not yet given. Canaanite cities not involved in any special covenant with God. These cities and the cities that are surrounding them were not in any special covenant. What are the sins that are emphasized? Sexual violence and homosexuality. Now, not only were these people going against the natural order, when they said, let those guys out so that we may know them, and Lot said no, they said, well, if you don't let them out, we're going to drag them out here, and we're also going to drag you out to do worse to you than we were going to do to them. We're going to force ourselves upon them. They were sexually immoral and sexually violent. Sodom is condemned for doing what they should have known was evil. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out forcing yourself on another person is evil. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out male goes with female. Lot went out, it says Lot went out to the men at the entrance, shut the door after him, and said, I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. How's Lot appealing to wickedness if there's no standard of morality? That's the question I would ask. Lot knows they should know better, and he's saying, please don't act so wickedly. I know this is wicked, and you know this is wicked. Please don't do this. In Amos 1 and 2, we have the oracles against the nation. These oracles are against Gentile nations. They're not against the Jews. Well, the Jews make their way into them, by the way, but most of it is to the Gentile nations. There's Damascus, there's Gaza, there's Tyre, there's Edom, there's Ammon, and there's Moab. Let's look at their sins. Why was Damascus condemned? Because they threshed Gilead with threshing sledges of iron. Brutal violence. Why is Gaza guilty? They carried into exile a whole people to deliver them up to Edom. Human trafficking. Why is Tyre guilty? They did not remember the covenant of brotherhood. They betrayed and breached loyalty. Edom pursued his brother with the sword, and his anger tore perpetually. Bloodthirst and revenge. Ammon, ripped open pregnant women, grotesque cruelty, and a disregard for life. Moab, burned the bones of the king of Edom to lime. They were desecrating the dead. These are things, none of these sins require a special revelation. None of these sins require someone to tell you this is wrong. There's something about them that's brutal and evil, and humans know. And that's not because God inherently put it in them. That's because God made them able to recognize it through their conscience and through natural revelation. They violate natural conscience, human dignity, and the moral fabric God built into the created order. And so, let's talk about progressive revelation a little bit before we close. Let's talk about how progressive revelation shapes Paul's argument. What is progressive revelation? This is that God revealed his will gradually over time in increasing depth and increasing clarity. You can think of the dawn sort of as creation. God's nature is seen through creation, and that's what's talked about in Romans 1, 19 through 20. We can see the morning, so to speak, as Moses and the prophets. God's will is written down in law and is clarified a little bit more. We can see the noonday where the sun is the brightest, Jesus, where the Word is made flesh. Paul reflects on this chronology. In Romans 1, Gentiles are judged by natural revelation. In Romans 2, Jews are judged by the law of Moses. And in Romans 3, justification by faith in Jesus Christ has been revealed. And so, how does progressive revelation shape Paul's argument? Progressive revelation explains why Paul begins with natural law, because that's what God revealed first. He's got to start at the start. It's a pretty logical way to begin. Since not all nations received the Torah, God could not hold all people to Mosaic standards. God's not an unjust God. He doesn't hold you accountable to what you don't know. He holds you accountable to what you do know. The judge of all the earth is going to do right. This sets up Paul's entire argument. All have sinned because both natural law and the Torah have been violated. People have rejected God on a mass scale. Mosaic law was not God's starting point, but it was the next logical step in order to amplify sin, in Romans 5:20, in order to preserve people through whom Christ would come, Romans 9, and to serve as a guardian before faith in Jesus came, Galatians 3 and verse 24. Gentiles are not judged for not keeping Torah, but for expressing the truth that they know that they had. I've said that multiple times because I want to drive that home. Men are not condemned for not knowing things. Men are condemned for knowing things and rejecting them. So, the progression of Paul's argument builds anticipation for the gospel the same way progressive revelation does. Did you catch that? You know, this progressive revelation, as the prophets reveal more and more things over time, the anticipation rose. And by the time John came, the anticipation was at its highest. And when you're reading the book of Romans, that's what happens. You're reading the Gentiles have sinned, the Jews have sinned, everyone's unrighteous. So what's the answer, Paul? The righteousness of God that's been revealed is the answer. The movement from creation to law to Christ shows the increasing need for God's grace. Natural law reveals guilt. Mosaic law multiplies guilt and points to a Savior, and the gospel reveals righteousness through faith. Progressive revelation shows that God always had a plan. That's important. God always had a plan. Nobody caught God off guard. Adam and Eve didn't catch God off guard in the garden, and no man catches God off guard in any way. The gospel is the culmination of every previous stage of revelation. This emphasizes the harmony of Scripture. Natural law, Torah, and the gospel are not contradictions, but milestones on the same road. You're getting progressively more truth and more truth, but you finally get the culmination of it. So what have we learned? We've learned that if wrath is already upon humanity, the gospel is not merely helpful, it's the only way out. It's our only escape. It's our only rescue. The gospel isn't just for people who want religion. It's for everyone, because everyone is guilty. They're without excuse for rejecting the light that they know exists. The failure to honor God leads not to neutrality, but to foolishness and corruption. Mankind does not self-correct once the truth is rejected. We don't drift towards righteousness. We plunge deeper and deeper into our own delusions. Once God gives someone over to their sin and judgment, the gospel becomes the only rescue from a mind that has been corrupted. We learn from Paul's list of sins also that the gospel is not just for big sinners, so to speak. Now, we've talked about there are sins that are worse than others, but I also want to make this statement. All sin can send you to hell. It doesn't matter. But there are sins that are worse. There are sins that are more egregious. We need to make that distinction. Sin spreads in societies when righteousness is ignored, and approval of sin makes one as guilty as the ones who actually practice that sin. The gospel doesn't just offer hope, it offers rescue from a condition that we cannot fix. Romans 2 And 12 says, for all who have sinned without the law will also perish without the law. And all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. That's a way to say all people are going to be judged under the law that they've been given. Paul's answer to those who have never heard is that they had enough. They had enough to seek God. What they knew about God should have caused them to look for him, but they chose to worship something else. And so the final thought, Romans 1, 18 through 32 is phase 1 of Paul's sweeping indictment of humanity. It shows the downward spiral of sin when truth is rejected, and it sets up the inescapable conclusion. What's that conclusion? What then? Are we Jews any better off? No, not at all. For we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin. As it is written, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands. No one seeks for God. So what's the answer? Jesus Christ, in whom the righteousness of God has been revealed. I appreciate you guys for your patience. We'll now kind of open it up to see if there's any questions, comments, or anything someone would like a little bit of clarity on.
Just wanted to add, you mentioned that you could look to nature, to animals, to show that the unnatural relation of homosexuality being unnatural. And I'm not a zoologist, so I don't know how to parse all this out, but there are definitely a lot of people that claim today just the opposite. Mm-hmm. And the only thing I would say, you really had it in your presentation that to appeal to the animal world for morality is the result of this degrading of man.
Absolutely.
And so regardless
Absolutely.
of what animals do, the idea that that can be an approval for human behavior.
And I would even add that quote-unquote homosexual behavior in animals is still not the norm. It's still not what you see as the norm. You still see the way offspring is created is through male and female. So even when people bring up that point, that's still not the normative action that nature takes.
I might give you just a little pushback on calling it or suggesting that homosexuality is a mental disease, disorder, or dysfunction.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that you need to say it is a spiritual disease, disorder, or dysfunction, which can cause physical disease, disorder, or dysfunction, and mental disease, disorder, or dysfunction.
I would agree with that. I would agree. Thank you for that clarification, by the way. So any other questions, comments, anything anyone would like to add?
You talked about the natural trajectory of sin
Mm-hmm.
and how people will not self-correct. Earlier you talked about Paul turning someone over to Satan in hopes that people learn to do better.
Mm-hmm.
It seems almost like
Well, you're not going to self-correct in an unrepentant state. When clarity comes, like it doesn't say that the prodigal son came back in his sin. It says when he came to himself. So when he realized what he was doing was wrong, when God took away his restraining hand and allowed him to go into sin, something about that can sometimes reach people. Now the norm is not that people self-correct, but that's the last resort when someone wants to persist in sin, is you give them up. That's God's last resort as well. Brendan?
Just very briefly, I appreciate, even though you had so much ground to cover, that you came down to just a little bit of the idea of disobedience to parents. I think Romans 1 is just great encouragement to those of us who are parents. It's our job to teach them to respect our authority. They're not just going to naturally know how to do that. And when we fail in that regard, we're not setting them up for social consequences. And we are setting them up for social consequences. That's not the worst. That list in Romans 1, listing it side by side with hating God, and sexual immorality, and murder, and things, shows that we're setting our kids up for spiritual destruction.
When you reject parental authority, the extension of that is you reject God's authority. That's the logical extension, and that's the degradation of society. Anybody else have anything they'd like to
I
add?
want to ask another question just right quick. Do you believe it's possible to be ignorant of natural law? Like Paul says that he was formerly a blasphemer, persecutor, injurious, but he obtained mercy because he did it ignorantly, as he spoke to those on Mars Hill in Acts 17. He says that they worship the unknown God ignorantly, course, in both of those, that was something that was positive law. Do you think it's possible to be ignorant in this way toward natural law?
That's a really good question. And the answer is, I don't know.
This is why God destroyed the Canaanites. They got to a point as a society where all children were going to grow up lost. And God can make the goal when that happened, but it was multi-generational. The needs of the parents, they're teaching their children this, society is teaching it, and it got to a point where there was no hope anymore, and they had lost sight of all natural law. And that's when God brought judgment.
I appreciate that, because that speaks to the fact that natural law is not necessarily inherent, but it can be learned.
Yes.
I appreciate that.
Natural law means it was revealed in nature. Proverbs talks about he has founded the earth on wisdom. He baked it into creation. You can overcome it. To your point, you can sear your conscience. You can become darkened. People do lose a knowledge of natural law, not because God hadn't made it known, not because he hadn't baked it into creation, but because the world gets so dark. And that's when you see Judgment Day occur over in Scripture.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that. And Cody, you had one more?
This goes to the same conclusion of what you just said at the end, but you might, I don't know how far back it is, but there's that slide where you had the progression
Okay.
of a society, the beginning with tolerance, then justifying the sin, then celebrating the sin, and demanding affirmation, which I think we would generally agree, if we're not fully into the demanding of affirmation now, some of the things that Paul even uses, that it's kicking in.
Yeah. No,
I would just say, to add to that, that the next steps are that saints are killed, and then the society is destroyed and judged. And in that order.
That's good.
I'd add to that a glass half full approach. Okay? So it's easy to do the glass half empty. There's a lot to complain about right now. But in the last year, we've had a radical transformation on a societal level where transgenderism is not being pushed like it was a year ago.
I agree.
And there's a lot of people who can still recognize natural law in this country, and they're getting tired of it. And there's an opportunity to be loud for truth because people are tired of the darkness. They've tolerated it for a long time, and they're coming to themselves a little bit, seize the opportunity, because that window won't always be there, and then you'll be back in glass half empty.
Absolutely. That's good. It's kind of, it speaks to that concept of God giving people over. Sometimes, man, I didn't think about that. Sometimes God giving someone else over can make someone from the outside looking in say, I don't want to end up like that. So it may not just be for the sake of that person, but it could be for the sake of others surrounding them. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to say or ask? You good? All right, I appreciate you guys for your patience, and I hope God is glorified in all that I've done.
All right, we'll take just a brief break.